Welcome to Drupal 8 Multilingual Setup Tips and Tricks for a Good User Experience. Now, how many people of you have already set up a multilingual site? Oh, that's quite a lot. Alright, let's do this. So, about me. My name is Tom Robert and I've been a Drupal developer for 5 years now. Currently, I'm working at Dazzle, and these are my Twitter handler and our company's Twitter handler. Why am I giving this presentation? Well, first of all, I really want a Raspberry Pi, but that's not the main reason. Multilingual is embedded in core in Drupal 8, so we have no need for Contrib modules like internationalization or entity translation. This allows us to create a standardized workflow that is easy to understand and reusable in other sites. Another reason is that a developer is not a translator and a translator is not a developer. Meet our team. The developer, he will use Google Translate for everything. And our translator, well, you know, when he has too much options, this can happen to your site. We all need to work together to make our site usable and for this user. Now, the goal of this session is to explain to you our preferred setup. I'm going to pitch some ideal scenarios. And the problems that we've encountered and how we implemented those solutions. So that it's easy to use for a webmaster, for a visitor, and everybody using your application. I'm going to talk to you about the basic setup, about content translation, menu translation, interface translation, configuration translation, and the Contrib modules. First, the basic setup. We require some core modules. For instance, we need the language module, which allows us to define new languages. We need the content translation. With this module, we can translate user-generated content. We need the interface translation. With this module, we will translate system-generated strings. And those are strings that are defined in a PHP code, like next, previous, or register. And last of all, we need the configuration translation. Well, this is new in Drupal 8, and it is only for site-specific translations like the site name or your field labels. Now, we can set up our languages at this spot. Now the slides will be available afterwards, so you don't have to write it down. Here we can add new languages. As you can see on this site, I already added the Dutch and the French language, which is our trilingual site we're developing. After that, we need to configure how Drupal detects the current language. So our preferred way of detection and selection of our language is to use a URL with a path prefix. Now, here we configure it, and for consistency reasons, we like to give each language a path prefix instead of leaving the default language open. Now let me pitch an ideal scenario to you. Like a visitor, he will navigate to www.example.com. What we want then is that the user is forwarded to the browser default language, and if that language is not found, we wanted to revert to the default language, which is English in our case. After that, we want to set a language cookie. And if the user changes the language, you want to update that cookie. When the user returns to your website, he should automatically be redirected to the last known language. Of course, if he navigates directly to /yen, the language cookie should be set for the English language. Now, how can we accomplish this? That's why we need a developer's tweak. A developer, he can subscribe to a kernel event request and figure out how the logic works, or he can create his own language negotiation plugin. Let's talk about content translation. There are two ways of adding content, adding a content translation. One is on the content type edit page, and the other is on the content language page, or a language list page. On the content edit page, we only have the basic options. Like here, we can define which default language should be used for a translation, if the language selector should be shown, and of course to enable translation for this content type. Now, to avoid confusion, we like to set the default language to the current interface language, and we like to hide the language selector so that the user is aware of the language he is translating to. So if he's in a Dutch context, he knows he is adding a Dutch translation. On the content language page, we have more options. We have the same options as the content type edit page, but we can also define which fields are allowed to be translated. So if you want, for example, an image field that is consistent over all translations, you can disable it here, and it will be the same on every translation. Then if we go on every article page, we then see the translate tab, where our translator can translate the article. Now for developer's tweak, the permissions to see the translation tab is only to create a translation and has view rights. So this is not good when you have multiple roles who can update different bundles. So that's why we prefer to show the tab and translation access on when the user has an update access. So we can modify this by altering the roots and set the requirement for the translation overview to an update action. So let's talk about menu translations. We have two ways of translating a menu. The first one is to localize, which means we keep one menu, but we translate every menu item, so we translate every link. With this we have a problem because we can't have an extra menu item in, example, the Dutch language, so they have to be exactly the same, and this limits our possibilities for future things. So we like to translate our menu, which means we create three different menus for each language. We create a menu in each language. So each language can have its own menu set, and this makes it more open for future. So every language can define their own language menu items. Now we also have a developer suite for this, because Drupal by default, it will show all defined menus in a content edit page. So as you can see here, we're in English setup, but we can also see the main menu for French or the main menu for Dutch. So that's why I created an issue on Drupal.org that fixes this problem, and it will only show the menus that are available in your menu context, in your language context. Next up is the interface translation, which can be found at this page. Like here, we can translate system-generated strings. And from new in Drupal 8 is that we can also translate against the default English language. Woohoo. So we can enable this English interface translation on the language settings page. So we just have to check enable interface translations for English, which is pretty good. Now let's talk about configuration translation. We also have two possibilities to translate configuration. One is on the config entity page, and the other one is on the configuration translation page. So this is an example of the content entity translations, where we want to translate our label for the body fields. So here we just create a translation for the Dutch label. Now, on the configuration translation page, here you have an overview of all site configurations. So if you want to, oh, this is pretty small, but we encounter a problem with this method. Like when you create a new configuration, it is always saved in the active language, so the current active context. So if we want to create a translation in English, like the original, if we add a field in English, the original translation is English. And if we add a field in Dutch, the original translation is Dutch. This is not very consistent and is confusing for a translator. So we have a developer's tweak for that. We can react on an onConfig save, and on an onConfig save event we can get the default language code. Here we can set the default language code when a configuration is saved. So every configuration is saved against the default language of a page, of the site. But what do we do with the existing configuration? Well, there's a pretty easy solution for that. We're going to replace every line code with a default line code. Because configuration can be exported to YAML files, we export it, and then we just run a simple Linux command, like a find and replace on all the files that have the line code NL, and we replace it with line code EN. This we should do for all available languages. And then we import the configuration again. Now, in an ideal scenario, a translator should be able to add or alter configuration translations for every language. But we don't want to give the translator access to original language, because otherwise he has too much access to the system, and this still might happen. We have a solution for that, and it's called the locked languages. Drupal ships out of the box with two locked languages. It's like the not specified or the non-applicable. The advantage of these languages is that they don't show up in the language switcher, and you can't really create a content translation for a locked language. So the non-applicable language is the most logical solution to save your configuration for. So here's another developer's tweak. We do exactly the same as before. We react on the onSave event, but instead of saving the default language code, we use the non-applicable language code. So we update the config files with the simple Linux command. Then we have to patch core, so configuration translations, it allows translation against locked languages. I've created a small patch for that on this URL. So now a translator will only see this, and he can't really alter the original value. So he doesn't have access to the field, but he can add or edit all labels, all configuration labels for this field. Another thing is, like, every configuration is translatable. Like, a configuration is actually a fragment of a normal configuration. Translation is a fragment of a normal configuration file. So we can add overrides to this specific configuration, and we can translate every configuration even if it isn't not available in the Drupal interface. So, for example, we have the site logo. It doesn't show up in the Drupal interface, but if we copy the configuration file to the language folders, we can also alter the Drupal site logo. So basically, a translator, this is the only access he should have on your website. Like, he should only be able to use the interface translation and the configuration translation, and of course he should also translate content. Contrib modules. Like, I'm going to talk about Pathauto a little bit and about the paragraphs Contrib module. Pathauto, it will work fine right out of the box, but if you want to use this token to specify your pattern, then there is a problem when you want to do a bulk update, because the token module needs to be patched so it can handle the different menus in different languages. Paragraphs, it's also a very good module that we regularly use, but it only supports localization out of the box, which means you can only translate the paragraph entity fields, but not really the host entity. So every translation will have the same amount of paragraphs, and they will have the same order on every translation. For us, this is not really an ideal solution, because we know translations, they might vary, and some paragraphs might be only available in the Dutch language and may not be shown in the French language. So we created a patch for this too, to allow asynchronic translations, which you can download over there. So, conclusion. In the end, we all want a consistent site that is easy to use and easy to understand for everybody that is involved. And above all, we want a site that is translated, obviously. So, are there any questions? Okay. No questions? I guess it was clear. Well, then I would like to thank you for your attention and thank the sponsors for allowing me to give this presentation.